On paper, Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro, has not had much of a record on which to campaign ahead of Sunday's presidential election. In the 11 years since Maduro inherited the presidency from the bellicose demagogue Hugo Chavez, Venezuela's economy has shrunk by roughly 3/4. Perhaps 8 million of its people, a third or so of the population, have given up hope and fled. Crime is bad, corruption is worse, and Maduro's United Socialist Party have pursued an undisguised campaign of state capture, suborning the country's institutions to their whim. Possibly due to the difficulties of pitching 6 more years of this to the beleaguered citizens of the Bolivarian Republic, Maduro's regime has taken steps to preordain the results of Sunday's vote. The principal opposition figurehead, Corina Machado, was disbarred from the ballot on a technicality. Hundreds of opposition activists have been arrested and many opposition rallies and events disrupted by security forces. The absurd tragedy of all of which is that there is no need at all for Venezuela to suffer the miserable existence of a poverty-stricken pariah state. It could and should be wealthy, orderly and happy. It has larger oil reserves than any other country on Earth, ready access to the Atlantic and the Caribbean, and an abundance of the natural beauty that foreign tourists would travel a long way to see. Venezuela could well do with a spell of not being run by bunglers and crooks. Is Venezuela's luck about to change? Is there any chance the votes on Sunday will be counted fairly? And will President Maduro accept the result if he loses? This is the Foreign Desk.
Recent polls shows that Venezuelan people is willing to go on the streets to fight for democracy and to defend their will. So if Nicolás Maduro takes that option of the fraud, he's going to face the courage and the determination of the Venezuelan people.
7.7 million Venezuelans have left. The bulk of those have gone to neighboring countries, Colombia and Brazil. They now have skin in the game. Colombia and Brazil have been very welcoming to these refugees, but it's creating strains on their public services, even in terms of local politics.
We haven't had a real statement on the opposition. They talked about liberty and freedom, but they haven't really put forward an economic plan. If they take office, they're looking at a national assembly that belongs to the opposition. The reality is that you may control the federal government, but you may not control the rest of the institutions in that society.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Mueller. Our first guest is Paola Bautista de Alemán, advisor to opposition leader María Corina Machado. Paola, let's start with the slightly strange arrangement that the opposition have had to come up with. María Corina Machado has not been able to be a candidate as such, so how would you define her role?
Well, she is with no competition, and nobody doubts it, that she is the leader of the opposition. She won the primary elections on October 22, and she was banned from the government to be the candidate for the presidency. And then she and the political parties that are the coalition of the opposition in our country, they found a new candidate that could run, that was accepted by the regime, and his name is Edmundo González Urrutia. And we are really happy to say that we think that he is going to win, and it's going to be over for the dictatorship of Nicolás Maduro.
But to be clear, when people vote for Edmundo González, will they vote for him on the understanding that they're actually voting for María Corina Machado, or is Edmundo González a more independent figure than that?
He's going to be the president of the republic. There is no doubt about that. And it's going to be a government formed by a coalition and a government of unity, where María Corina Machado is going to have a place. And also Edmundo González Urrutia always says that she can have the place that she wants in the new government. So that demands a lot of political maturity of the position. And I think that we are on that moment, a moment of maturity, unity, and coalition.
How difficult has it been to keep that discipline together? Because this has been one problem that Venezuelan opposition movements have had before now. I mean, probably not the biggest problem. The biggest problem, and we will get to it, is that you are running against the kind of regime you're running against. But what has been different this time? Is there an understanding that there is a real opportunity here?
Yes, I think that there are few differences from other moments that we have had in our democratic struggle. I think that the first difference is that we are completely united. The opposition is one bloc. And that's because the source of this unity is the people. We had a primary election where the people said who wanted to choose as the leader, and the leader is María Corina, and she is the head of the unity, and and she is a great leader. So I think that the unity is one difference that we have in this occasion. The other difference that we have is that the people wants to vote, even though we know that is a non-competitive election, that they are far from being free and fair. People know that to move forward in peace and in a constitutional way, we need to vote. And there is an enthusiastic movement, social movement in the whole country to go to the ballot, to vote, to win, and to get into power. The third one is that we have the support and solidarity of the international world. And that is very, very important. And the fourth is that the people are not afraid anymore. And that's simply beautiful to see how people, they have been with a lot of troubles with the regime for a lot of years, where they try to take their conscience for food or for education or for documents, as it happened in Cuba or in other countries. And people are not more afraid, and they are going to vote this Sunday.
Just to be clear, though, you don't think this vote on Sunday will be free and fair? You don't think the votes will be fairly counted? You do think the regime will try to steal this if it turns out they've lost?
Yes, I think that's a risk. I think that Nicolás Maduro right now, it has to be very worried, and he knows that he's in trouble. And that's very dangerous for us as politicians and activists, because the only thing that they have right now is repression and fraud. And of course, that's a way that they can take on Sunday. Recent polls shows that Venezuelan people is willing to protest and to go on the streets to fight for democracy and to defend their will. So if Nicolás Maduro takes that option of the fraud, that it's a really, really bad option, he's going to face the courage and the determination of the Venezuelan people.
Is there, and again, it's an easily imaginable scenario, which I'm sure you've thought about if I've thought of it, that Maduro just tries to delay and obfuscate, because as I understand it, there is a long transition, right? The next president would not be sworn in until January. So that's a lot of time for Maduro to maneuver. How do you manage that period, even if he makes some indication that, okay, maybe I'll step down, maybe I'll talk about this, maybe I won't?
Well, I think that the next step is a serious, huge negotiation with the regime, with the new government that has won the election and the regime that knows that it has to leave power. And on that process of negotiation, we are going to need international mediation. And I think that these 6 months are going to be negotiation process that will coordinate the transfer of power in our country.
Would part of those negotiations potentially be, how to put it, any concessions that might protect Maduro and those around him from the consequences of their actions? The Drug Enforcement Agency of the United States has a $15 million bounty on Maduro's head. There's several Venezuelan officials wanted by the ICC. None of these people are going to want to face that kind of justice. Is that something you would be willing to discuss with them?
Yes, María Corina Machado and Edmundo González, they have said many times that on this negotiation, they are going to offer guarantees to people on the regime who wants to respect the will of the Venezuelan people and open doors to democracy. And this negotiation, the field of the negotiation and the terms of the negotiation is going to be our constitution. On the sanctions and the thing that you referred on Nicolás Maduro, those are decisions on the Biden administration, and we don't have how to say on that topics.
Just wondering as well if you can give us an insight into the difficulties of trying to campaign as the opposition against Nicolás Maduro's regime, because this, to understate matters wildly, has not been a normal election campaign as most of our listeners would think of it. What kind of obstacles have you found yourself up against?
Well, Andrew, that's a wonderful question, because this is a non-competitive election and this is not an ordinary campaign. What happens on democratic countries, and it's completely normal, as huge rallies or people who goes outside with a sticker with the name of their candidates or with his option on the T-shirt, is completely an act, a heroic act and courage act here in our country. Our main leader, María Corina Machado, is not allowed to fly on commercial flights in our country, so she has to do all the trips around the country by car, like 8 hours, 12 hours, 20 hours by car to get to a place and talk to the people. Also, 5 of the main leaders of the campaign team of the presidential campaign are refugees in the Argentina embassy here in Caracas. Also, 2 more are in prison. And since July the 4th, where officially the campaign began, 77 people have been put in jail without a judicial process. So it's a risky business to do politics right now in our country, but we are more than happy to do it because we know this is the peaceful, the constitutional, and the democratic way to recover the prosperity in our country.
For all of that, have you been trying to, I guess, conjure any kind of normality for this election campaign? Have you been campaigning on issues other than the illegitimacy of the Maduro regime and their refusal to adhere to democratic norms? Have you been campaigning on the sort of stuff that a party might campaign on in a more functional democracy?
That's another interesting question because, we've been fighting for democracy for more than 25 years. So we know what we want. So we have a proposal for the country. The proposal is democracy, prosperity, and freedom. And that we can see those ideas on the economic proposals, that the first steps on the government are going to be to move over the humanitarian crisis and stabilize the economy, and also to open the main freedoms that are established in our constitution. Venezuela is in a really bad shape right now. We have over 70% of poverty, more than 7 million people that has left the country due to this terrible humanitarian situation. And we are really, really open to reestablish this new country to our people.
Paola, thank you. That was Paola Bautista de Alemán, political advisor to Venezuela's opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado. Well, listening to that first interview was Chris Sabatini, Senior Fellow for Latin America at Chatham House, and he joins me in the studio now. Chris, we heard a lot there from Paola about what they're up against and how they might manage the difficulties that could follow Sunday's vote. But this is an election in which I'm going to go ahead and take a wild guess. Venezuela's neighbours are taking an extremely close interest in.
That's exactly right. This goes beyond the domestic issues of human rights and democratic and regime change. This is regional, even in some ways geopolitical. Let's talk about the neighbors first. As Paola mentioned, 7.7 million Venezuelans have left. The bulk of those have gone to neighboring countries, Colombia and Brazil. They now have skin in the game. For the first time, 850,000 Venezuelans have been sort of nationalized or regularized. In Brazil, there are more than 1 million in Colombia. And if you look at polls, more than 30% of the people say they'll leave the country if Maduro is reelected. So there's a real stake for these countries.
That's 30% of the people who haven't left already.
Exactly. So there's some real skin in the game here because Colombia and Brazil have been very welcoming to these refugees, but it's creating strains on their public services, even in terms of local politics. So there's a real interest on the part of President Luis Inácio Lula da Silva of Brazil, who's center-left of the Workers' Party, and the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, to see this issue resolved. And quite frankly, not just to see a free and fair election, but to see a change of government, although they would be loath to say that.
Well, leaders of the ilk of Lula and Petro in particular would have been assumed, I think, not all that long ago, to be natural allies of a regime like Maduro's. In many respects, it does seem remarkable that Maduro's lasted this long, basically still trying to maintain the Hugo Chavez personality cult, but without the personality. But does Maduro have any actual friends left in the region, or does basically everybody wish he'd hang it up?
It's really a rogues gallery of allies he has right now. Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, who basically has recreated a North Korean-type regime in Nicaragua. Cuba, and it's an interesting dynamic with Cuba because Hugo Chavez was the one who built the relationship and sort of cemented it, if you will, with shipping 100,000 barrels of oil a day to Cuba, which Cuba sold about half of on the international market and could keep its regime afloat. I think part of what's the negotiation that will occur that Paola talked about is talking to the Cubans and saying, look, if the opposition wins, they're not going to cut off your oil. Because there are Cuban spies and agents providing information, but their interest is their own survival. And I can tell you this, having spoken to Cuban diplomats, they're a little bit embarrassed and ashamed of the way that the Maduro government has behaved. It's deeply corrupt in ways that the Cuban regime isn't, for all of its lack of democracy. So I think it's those two governments. And then, of course, outside there's Russia. And Russia owns a lot of distressed Venezuelan debt. It sent 2 warships to Venezuela a few weeks ago that docked in its port. Russia has also been able to use Venezuela to try to launder its cash and try to evade sanctions. So Russia has some real skin in the game. The problem is it's far away and it really can't exercise much more than maybe some intelligence and some other factors. So it has become an isolated regime. And should Maduro government ham-fistedly steal this election, Brazil and Colombia will certainly jettison their ties. And I think all of the niceties that they've wrapped their diplomatic initiatives in the past with Maduro, those will be off the table.
In that eventuality, how long can Maduro last? I mean, you mentioned Daniel Ortega building North Korea in Central America. Could Maduro do something similar, linked only to the outside world via Russia, perhaps Iran, perhaps China?
He could. The question is how long it would last. First of all, obviously, Venezuela is not Nicaragua. Nicaragua was the second poorest country in the hemisphere. It's a couple. Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo are the president and vice president, their husband and wife. The Maduro regime is much more internationally connected. It also is much more diverse. You have a military whose allegiances we're not really sure about. Certainly the top brass is in favor of Maduro, but below that, there's really good mounting evidence that the foot soldiers in particular and non-commissioned officers are turning against the government. I don't think you have that sort of cohesion in the Maduro government to do what Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo did, because I think it would fracture the regime.
If we look at what is probably depressingly the likeliest outcome, i.e. that Maduro loses the election and then refuses to acknowledge that he has lost the election, and that could... Your best option at that point is stasis. Your worst option is absolute implosion of the state. Is there any role that the United States could play here, or is this one of those things where, given the last couple of 100 years of history, the United States might take the view that literally anything we do is only going to make things worse?
I think it will play a role, but it's going to play a role behind the scenes. Last week, President Lula's foreign policy advisor, Celso Amorim, met with the White House. The foreign minister from Colombia, Luis Gilberto Murillo, also was there in the meeting. But you don't see the U.S. making large, loud proclamations. What the U.S. can do in this case is assist any sort of, whether multilateral or regional diplomatic initiative and mediation, to be able to offer incentives. So as Paola was saying earlier, there's a $15 million bounty on Maduro's head, more than 50 government officials that are under DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency, indictments, for corruption, narcotics trafficking, as well as for human rights abuses. And of course, there's the ICC, International Criminal Court indictments. The U.S. can, first of all, signal that it will lift those sanctions and those indictments, and that could even further lift economic sanctions if the Maduro regime were to step down quietly, or even try to negotiate some sort of form of a more coalition government. So the U.S. can play a very quiet and important role, but I think it's best, and we're seeing this already, if it stays, as they say in Spanish, un medio paso atrás, a half step behind.
How much, though, rejoicing will there be among Venezuela's neighbours, perhaps especially Brazil and Colombia, if, and this is a pretty big if, this is not the likely outcome, but suppose the vote goes against Maduro, suppose Maduro says, OK, fair enough, I've lost, I'll quit, and suppose the opposition that we've just been speaking to become the government, they do not appear natural allies of the likes of Petro and Lula. So what would the view be, that at least we've got rid of Maduro, there's somebody broadly sane we can deal with, or would there be an amount of tension?
There would be tension. If you speak to diplomats in both countries, both of those governments, they see Corina Machado, who is of the opposition, is very much of the right. They look at her and they see a supporter of the former right-wing president of Colombia, Alvaro Uribe, or Ivan Duque. Or if you're Lula, you look at Corina Machado and you see a supporter of Bolsonaro. She and Bolsonaro are very close. They have to hold their nose ideologically on this election, but they do want to see stability. And I do think, I'm going to make a bet here, I think it will come down to mediation. What you'll see them try to do is try to mediate a more diverse government that doesn't just reflect Maria Corina Machado's sort of ideological affinities, but reflects more of a broad coalition. Because quite frankly, in all of these cases, and I'm speaking actually today to a Brazilian diplomat, they're saying what we would have preferred to see is a more social democratic version of Maduro or Madurismo run in these elections, but that isn't what we got. So I think you're going to see, try to craft a vision in which some form of Chavismo remains in the political game, but a much more democratic manifestation, a much more social democratic manifestation in a way that builds stability. Because honestly, as polarized as the country is, the words of mostly now Maduro of a bloody civil war, that would only spell more upheaval and more exodus from the country to the neighboring countries.
That was Chris Sabatini, Senior Fellow for Latin America at Chatham House. This is The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller. President Nicolás Maduro is obviously on the ballot on Sunday, but so is what he represents, or claims to. This is the creed of Chavismo, named for his predecessor and patron, President Hugo Chavez, who died in 2013. While little of what Chavez and Chavismo promised has been delivered, Maduro does nevertheless retain a constituency. But who is it? Well, joining me finally to answer this question and others is Miguel Tinker Salas, Venezuelan professor of history and Latino studies at Pomona College in California, and author of, among other books, Venezuela, What Everyone Needs to Know. Miguel, first of all, could you give us a sense, very shortly ahead of this election, and you are in the country now, how it feels to be in Venezuela right now? Is there much excitement attending this election on Sunday?
There's excitement, apprehension, but life continues normally. I mean, people are going to work, coming back from work. They're going grocery shopping. There's a little bit of panic shopping, lines for gasoline. But the sense is that there's tremendous normality. Now, on the social media side, if you were to turn your cell phone on, you'd be bombarded by a whole plethora of documents and statements that you can't attribute to anybody because they're all made up.
Well, I don't think that situation is necessarily peculiar to Venezuela. I think you've just described the world we all live in. But away from social media, to what extent is Venezuela's actual media able to report anything that's happening at the moment?
The media is mostly controlled by the government, or has the access for the government. So you see Maduro's close of the campaign, you see his rallies, you see his actions. You don't get to see the opposition side to the same extent. So they rely mostly on social media or the international press to get their message across.
You mentioned President Maduro, who is, of course, seeking re-election. I think to a lot of people looking at this election and Venezuela's situation from outside, it will seem incredible, all things considered, that anybody is going to vote for him at all. But obviously, there are Venezuelans who will. Is it possible to say who his constituency is? Who are Maduro's people?
he has a hard base of support that runs anywhere from 4 to 5 million people. That's really a determining factor in the election. If we were to go by the early polls that came out in the electoral process, they had the opposition candidate González winning by 70 to 30%, 70 to 40%. More recent polls have tightened that, and they're all in the margin of error by 6-point difference, particularly the ones done in the last couple of weeks that corrected for the mistakes and for the overestimations of the last ones. So Maduro does have a consistent base. Most of them are working class, lower economic sectors that, although have been buffeted by the crisis, and again, I underscore Maduro is the face of the crisis, the reality is they continue to support him because they have benefited in one way or another from some of the social programs proposed initially by Chavez and later by Maduro.
Hugo Chavez is the figure from whom Maduro inherited his current role when Chavez died back in 2013. He still does seem to loom quite large over Venezuela, and I was wondering if you could provide us there with a bit of context. Was Hugo Chavez and what he brought with him, the creed known as Chavismo, was that something entirely new to Venezuela, or did it have roots going back a lot further?
Popular leaders had roots going back a lot further. There's the contested vision of who was Simón Bolívar. Was he an autocratic oligarch, or was he a visionary that had the popular classes in mind? Then you go to the 19th century and you have campesino leaders like Ezequiel Zamora in the 19th century who fought for land and attacked the oligarchy. Then you had again in the beginning of the 20th century, Cipriano Castro, semi-nationalist president who espoused views of that kind, Medina Angarita, none of them popular in the context of Hugo Chavez. Hugo Chavez represented a dramatic break when he appears on the scene because Venezuela had been this model democracy proposed by the Venezuelan elites and the U.S. as the model to follow in Latin America until the Caracazo happened in the late 1980s and the whole system came collapsing down. And Hugo Chavez filled that void and gave voice to the deep Venezuela, to the Venezuela that had been erased out of the historical record or out of the political participation.
Hugo Chavez, for his manifold faults, was a powerful and charismatic communicator, which Nicolás Maduro is, well, to a much, much lesser extent. But was Chavez any more capable than Maduro as an actual administrator of these ideas? I guess what I'm asking there is, would the last 11 years have been dramatically different if Chavez had lived, or was this something that was always doomed to fail? It was just a question of by how much?
Chavez was an organic leader. He had a very clear connection to the populace, and Maduro struggles to have. But he struggles to establish and to maintain. Would there have been sanctions? Would they have had the impact on Chavez? Yes. Would the continued dependence on the oil economy have affected Chavez in the dramatic way it did? And Maduro? Yes, I think so. Would Chavez have provided other alternatives? There is the popular belief that he would have. Among the population, there is a sense that there is a Chavismo and there's Madurismo. Among the diehard Chavistas, they fundamentally believe that the problems that have happened under Maduro would not have happened under Chavez. Whether that can be really proven or not is counterfactual. The reality is that we're dealing with Maduro, we're dealing with him as the face of the crisis, and still with that, there's a tremendous amount of support that he can rely on.
Is there any prospect at all of an end to this crisis if Maduro stays in power? I know that he and people around him have been trying to point out that amid the disaster of the last decade and a bit, the last couple of years there's been a slight uptick in economic growth, but this is obviously from a very, very low base and measured against a GDP which may have been reduced by 3/4 before that.
No doubt. If you go to a market, there is no scarcity whatsoever. Everything is available, from luxury products to daily consumer products. The problem is the price. Given the fact that most Venezuelans who work receive 130 bolívares as minimum salary a month, and they have to work 2 or 3 or 4 jobs to make ends meet, obviously, there are difficulties. Yes, the economy has improved, but as you point out, what was the reference point was how much it had collapsed previously. So yes, it may be growing at 4.5%. Inflation may be more controlled, but there's still fundamental issues with the economy, the majority of which is still dependent on oil, which has not been producing to the same extent that it had in the past.
Is it possible to quantify the effect that has been had on not just Venezuela's economy, but Venezuelan society by this extraordinary exodus of perhaps 8 million people who in recent years have just given up and left?
It's a dramatic departure, one of the largest, if not the largest, migratory movements in the history of Latin America, if not the history of the world. And they have an important impact on the election, because that means that before you start the electoral process, you already have 20% abstentionism, because those individuals have left and the majority of them will not be able to vote in the Sunday election. Only something like 70,000 are voting from abroad, which means that when you start the voting process, and that's what some of the polls did not factor in terms of what the outcome might be, given the fact that 25% of the electorate is no longer here.
We don't know yet, obviously, what the result of the election is, and nor do we know how President Maduro might react if it turns out that the result has gone against him. In that eventuality, is he the ultimate decision maker, or is the military going to be a factor here?
I think the population is going to be a factor. If you have a tremendous voting percentage on Sunday, if there is a participation rate of 70, 80%, and the decision is very clear, I think Maduro's hands may be tied in terms of what the outcome might be. And there's going to be observers. There's going to be all kinds of ways of factoring in what happened. So I think that the outcome itself will be a significant factor. The other factor to consider is that the advantage goes to Maduro in the context of a machine. The political machine is the Chavista machine. The party machine is the Chavista machine. They know them in their neighborhoods. They know who voted for them last time. They know how to pull them out. The other group has a tremendous amount of spirit and a support, but they don't have the political machine that may decide the election in the ultimate.
And just finally, if it turns out that there is to be a new government as Venezuela, and as I understand it, they won't take office until January, and that does seem right now like a very long time in politics, where would they even start? I mean, the things that need fixing in Venezuela is a very, very long list. Do we have an indication of what an incoming government would regard as their priorities?
Well, we haven't had a real statement on the opposition. They've talked about liberty and freedom, and they've talked about all these broad issues, but they haven't really put forward an economic plan. There are videos out there with María Corina Machado saying she wants to privatize the oil company. That may not fare very well. So the reality is that oil company may require billions and billions and billions to come back up to its past presence. The other factor is that in January, if they take office, they're looking at a national assembly that belongs to the opposition. They're looking at a military. It's more like Nicaragua was when Violeta Chamorro against Ortega in 1989, where the reality is that you may control the federal government, but you may not control the rest of the institutions in that society.
That was the Venezuelan historian Miguel Tinker Salas joining us on the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for the Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Chris Chermak and Christy O'Grady. Christy also produces the Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Chris at cc@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle Magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.